Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Appalachian Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the autumn of 1889, the residents of Harlan County, Kentucky, awoke to an unusual silence. The small mining town of Blackwood Hollow, nestled between the rolling hills of the Appalachian Mountains, had always been a quiet place. But on September 17th, the silence was different. It was heavy, oppressive, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The Whitaker family home, a modest two-story structure standing at the edge of town, had been found empty. No signs of struggle, no blood, no broken windows, just emptiness. The breakfast table was set for 3, the food cold and untouched. Coffee, still in the pot, now turned to a bitter sludge. The only thing missing was the Whitaker family themselves: Thomas, the mine foreman, his wife Eleanor, and Thomas's elderly father, William. The disappearance might have been dismissed as another family moving on to seek better fortunes elsewhere, had it not been for one detail that didn't fit. Thomas Whitaker's pocket watch was found hanging from a nail on the front door, its glass face shattered. The hand stopped precisely at 3:17. According to Sheriff Maxwell's report, dated September 18, 1889, this was highly unusual. Mr. Whitaker was known to value that timepiece above all possessions, wrote the sheriff. A gift from his father, who received it from his father before him. He was never seen without it. This single detail transformed what might have been a simple departure into something far more troubling. The Whitaker home stood at the end of Elm Street, backing up against the dense forest that climbed the Appalachian slopes. It was a solid structure, built by Thomas's grandfather in the 1830s, when the coal mine first opened. The house had weathered storms, economic hardships, and even a brief occupation during the Civil War. By all accounts, it was a sturdy home for a respectable family. Thomas had worked his way up from a common miner to foreman, over 20 years of loyal service to the Blackwood Coal Company. Eleanor, originally from Virginia, had moved to Kentucky after their marriage in 1871. William, the elderly patriarch, had once been a mine engineer himself before age, and the coal dust in his lungs forced his retirement. According to town records, the Whitakers were regarded as quiet, hard-working people who kept to themselves. They weren't the type for socializing, recalled Martha Simmons, wife of the general store owner, in a statement given to the local newspaper. Mrs. Whitaker would come for supplies once a week, always polite but never lingering for gossip. Mr. Whitaker was respected at the mine, fair but stern. The old man, I barely saw him in the last years. Some said his mind was going. This assessment was echoed by most of the townspeople interviewed in the days following the disappearance. The Whitakers were present but peripheral to community life, existing in the town but somehow separate from it. In the days before they vanished, nothing seemed amiss. Thomas had been at work on September 16th, overseeing the opening of a new tunnel in the mine's eastern section. The company ledger shows he signed out at 5:45 p.m., his handwriting steady and unremarkable. Eleanor had visited the general store that afternoon, purchasing flour, coffee, and 3 yards of dark blue fabric. William had been seen by Dr. Harrison earlier that week for his persistent cough, receiving the usual prescription for a tonic that offered comfort, if not cure. There were no arguments reported, no unusual visitors observed, no indication whatsoever that 3 people were about to vanish from existence. The initial search was perfunctory. Sheriff Maxwell and 2 deputies examined the house, finding nothing to suggest violence or forced entry. They questioned neighbors who reported hearing nothing unusual that night. A cursory search of the surrounding woods yielded no clues. The mine was inspected in case some tragic accident had occurred, but Thomas's office was locked and undisturbed. After 3 days with no evidence of foul play, the official investigation was effectively abandoned. The prevailing theory, as noted in the sheriff's final report, was that the family had decided to relocate, perhaps due to William's declining health, and the broken watch was merely an odd coincidence or a symbolic gesture of leaving their old life behind. This might have been the end of the story, a minor mystery soon forgotten as the town moved on with its daily struggles. And indeed, for many years, that's exactly what happened. The Whitaker house stood empty, eventually becoming property of the coal company due to unpaid debts. New workers came and went. The mine expanded, contracted, and expanded again with the fluctuating demand for coal. The disappearance of the Whitakers became little more than a curious tale told to newcomers, a small-town legend lacking a satisfying conclusion, until 1937, when the Great Ohio River flood devastated much of Kentucky and the surrounding states. The waters rose higher than anyone had ever seen, transforming the landscape and uncovering secrets long buried. In Blackwood Hollow, the old Whitaker house, by then abandoned for nearly 50 years, suffered severe structural damage. The foundation shifted, walls cracked, and part of the cellar floor collapsed, revealing what appeared to be a hidden sub-basement that no one had known existed. James Cooper, a WPA worker assigned to assess flood damage in the county, made the discovery on April 3, 1937. His official report describes entering the dilapidated house and finding that the cellar floor had opened up like a rotten tooth, revealing a space beneath that didn't appear on any building plans. Descending into this unexpected chamber with only a flashlight, Cooper found a room approximately 10 feet square, with walls of fitted stone and a packed earth floor. The space was mostly empty save for a single wooden chair positioned in the center and what appeared to be a metal lockbox tucked into a corner. The lockbox, rusted but intact, contained a leather-bound journal, a set of letters tied with faded ribbon, and a collection of newspaper clippings dating from 1887 to 1889. The journal belonged to Eleanor Whitaker. The neat, precise handwriting chronicled the increasingly disturbing final months of the Whitaker household. These documents, combined with subsequent investigations, would finally bring to light what happened to the family that September night in 1889, a truth far more disturbing than anyone in Blackwood Hollow could have imagined. Eleanor's journal begins innocuously enough in January 1889 with entries about household matters, Thomas's work at the mine, and William's declining health. She writes of the harsh winter, of concerns about money, of small disputes with neighbors, the ordinary anxieties of everyday life. But by March, a new element enters her writing. She begins to mention sounds in the house that cannot be explained. Again, last night, the scratching in the walls, she writes on March 20th. Thomas insists it is merely rats, but the sounds do not move as rodents would. They remain in one place, persistent, almost deliberate. By April, Eleanor's entries become increasingly focused on William, her father-in-law. William spoke for nearly an hour today about the bad air in the house, she records on April 9th. He claims it follows him from room to room, that he can smell it even when no one else can. Thomas dismisses these as the ramblings of an old miner whose lungs and mind are equally damaged by years underground. I am not so certain. The entries suggest a household under strain, with Thomas working longer hours at the mine, William's behavior growing more erratic, and Eleanor caught between them, increasingly isolated and uneasy in her own home. A significant shift occurs in the journal in late May. On May 23rd, Eleanor writes, "William took me aside today while Thomas was at work. With perfect clarity, unlike his usual confused state, he told me that something had followed him home from the mine years ago. It waited, he said, it waited until I was too weak to fight it. When I pressed him for an explanation, his lucidity vanished, and he returned to mumbling about drafts and bad air." From this point forward, Eleanor's entries betray a growing paranoia. She begins to question whether William's seemingly delusional claims might contain some truth. The letters found with the journal provide another perspective. They are correspondence between Thomas Whitaker and Dr. Samuel Greaves, a physician in Louisville specializing in mental disorders. In these letters, dating from February to August 1889, Thomas describes his father's deteriorating condition and increasingly bizarre behavior. He insists on sleeping in a chair by the cellar door, Thomas writes in July. When I attempt to lead him to his bed, he becomes agitated, claiming he must keep watch. He speaks of something trying to come up from below, something that whispers to him through the floorboards. Dr. Greaves's replies suggest various treatments and ultimately recommends committing William to an asylum, a step Thomas seems reluctant to take. The newspaper clippings add yet another layer to the emerging picture. Most relate to mining accidents and deaths in the region, but several specifically concern incidents at the Blackwood mine where Thomas worked. One article from November 1887 describes a cave-in that trapped 7 miners for 3 days before rescue. William Whitaker, though retired by then, is mentioned as having provided crucial information about the old tunnels that aided in the rescue effort. Another clipping from February 1888 reports on a miner found wandering in the woods, delirious and unable to account for his whereabouts during the 48 hours he was missing. The man died 3 days later of unknown causes. The final entries in Eleanor's journal from September 1889 are increasingly frantic and difficult to follow. Her handwriting deteriorates, and she begins to report her own unexplained experiences: cold spots in the house, the sensation of being watched, objects moved from where she had left them. On September 14th, she writes, "William knows he has always known. I found him in the cellar today, tapping on the floor with his cane, listening intently to the sounds that returned. When he saw me, he smiled in a way that made my blood run cold. 'It's hungry,' he said. 'It has always been hungry.' I wanted to flee the house then and there, but where would I go? Who would believe me?" The final entry, dated September 16, 1889, consists of just a few lines. Thomas still refuses to listen. Says I have been influenced by his father's madness, but I know what I heard last night. Something is in the walls, in the floor beneath us. Not rats, not settling timber. Something that knows our names. William has made some kind of arrangement, I'm certain of it. God help us all." The journal ends there. What happened on the night of September 16th, 17th remained unknown until Cooper's discovery in 1937, and even then, the full picture emerged only gradually as researchers pieced together additional evidence over the following years. Dr. Harrison Ellsworth, a geologist and amateur historian who examined the site in 1938, made several significant discoveries that expanded on Cooper's initial findings. Beneath the earth floor of the hidden room, Ellsworth uncovered a narrow vertical shaft that descended approximately 30 feet before connecting to what appeared to be an abandoned mine tunnel, one that did not appear on any official maps of the Blackwood Coal Company's operations. This tunnel appears to have been dug by hand, using rudimentary tools, Ellsworth wrote in his report. It bears none of the hallmarks of professional mining techniques used in the region during the period. More disturbing is evidence suggesting it was excavated not from the mine outward, but from beneath the house downward, as if someone was attempting to connect the two locations in secret. Further investigation of mining company records revealed that William Whitaker had been involved in a sealed incident in 1857, more than 30 years before the family's disappearance. During the expansion of the eastern section of the mine, a tunnel collapsed, trapping William and 4 other men for nearly a week before rescue. The official report states only that they were found alive, though suffering from the effects of hunger, thirst, and bad air. However, a private letter from the mine owner to his lawyer, discovered in county archives in 1952, suggests something more troubling occurred. The men were rescued, as you know, the letter reads, but they are changed, particularly Whitaker. The company doctor suggests it is merely the shock of their ordeal, but I have my doubts. There is talk among the other miners of strange sounds heard while the men were trapped, of discoveries made in the darkness. Whitaker has requested to lead a new excavation in that same area, which I have denied. Some places in the earth are best left undisturbed. The mining company subsequently sealed that section of the mine and diverted operations elsewhere. William Whitaker continued working for another 15 years before his retirement, eventually moving in with his son Thomas and daughter-in-law Eleanor. Nothing in the official record suggests any connection between the 1857 incident and the family's disappearance in 1889. But the discovery of the hidden shaft connecting their home to the abandoned tunnel raises disturbing questions. Forensic analysis of the hidden room, conducted in the 1950s using more advanced techniques, detected traces of blood on the wooden chair and on portions of the stone walls. The amount was minimal, consistent with small cuts or nosebleeds rather than violence, but its presence nonetheless suggests the room was used for some purpose involving physical distress. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery made in 1962, when the old mine was finally being permanently sealed due to environmental concerns. Workers clearing the abandoned eastern tunnels discovered a small chamber, apparently hand-carved, set back from the main passage. Inside were found 3 sets of human remains, arranged sitting in a rough circle. Due to the dry, cold conditions of the deep mine, the bodies had partially mummified. They were identified through personal effects as Thomas, Eleanor, and William Whitaker. The medical examiner's report makes for grim reading. The bodies showed no obvious signs of violence, no broken bones, no gunshot wounds, no evidence of struggle. Yet all 3 had died under circumstances that defied easy explanation. Their postures suggested they had been placed deliberately, not fallen in death. More puzzling still, their eyes had been covered with strips of blue fabric, the same dark blue that Eleanor had purchased on her final visit to the general store. The official cause of death was recorded as suffocation, though whether by gas in the mine or by deliberate action could not be determined. The case was closed once again, the remains buried in the town cemetery, the old mine sealed for good. But questions remained, as they always do when the evidence suggests patterns too disturbing to fully acknowledge. What emerged from the collected evidence, the journal, the letters, the hidden room, and the final resting place of the Whitakers, was a narrative far more unsettling than a simple disappearance or even a conventional murder. It appeared that William Whitaker, during his entrapment in 1857, had encountered something in the darkness of the mine that altered him fundamentally. Whether this was a psychological break, a physical contaminant, such as toxic gas that damaged his brain over time, or something even more inexplicable, cannot be determined with certainty. What seems clear is that over the decades following this incident, William became convinced that whatever he had found in the mine was trying to reach him. In his declining years, living in his son's house, he appears to have begun excavating the secret room and shaft, possibly during periods when his dementia seemed to lift and he regained physical strength. The purpose of this excavation remains speculative, but Eleanor's journal suggests he was not trying to escape something, but rather providing a way for something to enter. Thomas Whitaker, by all accounts, a practical man devoted to his work, seems to have dismissed both his father's ravings and his wife's growing concerns as manifestations of mental instability. The letters to Dr. Greaves show his attempts to address his father's condition through medical means, while Eleanor's journal reveals his impatience with what he perceived as her susceptibility to suggestion. This failure to acknowledge the fears of his family members may have ultimately led to tragedy. What happened on the night of September 16th or 17th, 1889? The evidence allows for reconstruction, though certainty remains elusive. It appears that William, perhaps experiencing one of his periods of unusual lucidity and strength, somehow convinced or coerced Thomas and Eleanor to accompany him into the hidden room and down the shaft he had created. Whether through manipulation, threats, or some form of drugging, traces of an unidentified sedative were found in the preserved tissue of all 3 bodies. He brought his family into the darkness beneath their home. The placement of the bodies in the mine chamber suggests a ritual purpose, though the nature of this ritual can only be guessed at. The covering of the eyes with blue fabric might indicate a desire to shield them from seeing something, or perhaps a more symbolic blindfolding. The lack of obvious violence suggests they may have participated willingly, at least initially, perhaps convinced by William that this action was necessary for some purpose he perceived as vital. The pocket watch left hanging on the front door, its glass shattered and hand stopped, takes on new significance in this context. Was it a final symbolic act by William, marking the end of normal time for the family, or was it placed there afterwards by someone else entirely, someone who discovered what had happened and chose to seal the house rather than reveal its secrets? The watch was never found among the personal effects in the mine chamber, its absence another small mystery within the larger one. The case was officially closed in 1962, the findings deemed conclusive enough for legal purposes, if not for complete understanding. The Whitaker house was demolished shortly thereafter, the land reclaimed by the forest that had always pressed close against its boundaries. Blackwood Hollow itself declined as the coal industry contracted, eventually becoming one of many near-ghost towns scattered throughout Appalachia, its history preserved mainly in county archives and academic studies of the region. But local memory persisted, as it often does in places marked by tragedy. Residents of neighboring communities spoke of unusual sounds in the woods where the Whitaker house once stood, of cold spots that lingered even in summer heat, of a heaviness in the air that made breathing difficult and thinking unclear. These accounts were dismissed as superstition by outside researchers, but those who lived in the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains treated them with greater seriousness. Dr. Ellsworth, who had continued to study the case intermittently until his death in 1966, left behind a collection of notes that included interviews with miners who had worked at Blackwood in the years before and after the Whitakers' disappearance. These accounts, never published due to their unverifiable nature, suggest that William Whitaker was not the only one affected by whatever was encountered in the 1857 cave-in. Other survivors reported similar experiences, persistent sensations of being followed, of hearing whispers in empty rooms, of feeling compelled toward certain actions without understanding why. One miner, identified only as J.M. in Ellsworth's notes, described working alongside William in the years following the incident. He'd stop sometimes, right in the middle of work, and put his ear to the wall of the tunnel. "It's getting closer," he'd say. "Can't you hear it moving through the rock?" Most of us thought it was just the air playing tricks, or his mind going bad from the coal dust. But there were days. There were days when I thought I heard it too. Something shifting behind the walls, something that wasn't just settling earth or water seeping through. Something deliberate. Another account, from the widow of one of the other men trapped with William, suggests her husband became obsessed with digging in their cellar in the years before his death. He'd be down there at all hours, she told Ellsworth in 1940, said he needed to prepare the way. When I asked for what, he just smiled and said, "For what's coming." I filled in that hole after he died, poured concrete over it. Some things aren't meant to be disturbed. These testimonies, while compelling, fall short of providing a definitive explanation for what happened to the Whitakers. They exist in the liminal space between verifiable fact and folklore, between documented history and oral tradition. They suggest patterns and connections that the official record either missed or deliberately excluded, hints of something larger and more disturbing than a single family's tragedy. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case is how it resists complete resolution, how it leaves spaces for the imagination to fill with possibilities more disturbing than any confirmed fact. The evidence establishes certain parameters. 3 people died in unusual circumstances in an abandoned mine tunnel connected to their home by a secret passage. But the why remains elusive, hovering just beyond the reach of certainty. Was William Whitaker suffering from a progressive mental illness that manifested as delusions about something following him from the mine? Did he somehow convince or coerce his family to participate in a fatal ritual born of his deteriorating mind? Or did he indeed encounter something in the darkness during that week of entrapment in 1857, something that haunted him for decades, before finally claiming not just him, but his family as well? The physical evidence supports multiple interpretations, and the passage of time has eroded the possibility of finding new facts that might tip the balance toward one explanation or another. What remains is a story that continues to disturb precisely because it cannot be fully explained away, cannot be neatly categorized, and filed under solved. In 1967, the last significant research on the case was conducted by Dr. Margaret Holloway, a psychologist interested in family dynamics and collective delusions. Her analysis focused on the role of Eleanor Whitaker, suggesting that the young woman might have been the key to understanding what ultimately happened to the family. Eleanor's journal reveals someone increasingly isolated, caught between a husband who dismissed her concerns and a father-in-law whose behavior alternated between dementia and disturbing lucidity, Holloway wrote. She was the observer, the recorder, the one who documented the household's descent into whatever awaited them. But was she merely a witness, or did she play a more active role in the family's fate? Holloway points to subtle shifts in Eleanor's writing over time, noting how her initial skepticism about William's claims gradually transforms into a kind of reluctant belief. By September, she is experiencing her own unexplained phenomena, her worldview aligning more with the elder Whitaker than with her husband. There is a suggestion, Holloway proposed, that Eleanor may have been drawn into William's reality, perhaps through a folie à deux, a shared psychosis that can develop between closely associated persons, particularly in isolated settings. This psychological interpretation offers a framework for understanding how three people might willingly descend into darkness together, how a family might collectively participate in actions that led to their deaths. It suggests that by the end, Thomas may have been the only one still anchored to conventional reality, perhaps finally agreeing to enter the hidden chamber in a desperate attempt to prove to his wife and father that their fears were unfounded. Yet this explanation, while plausible, cannot account for all aspects of the case. It doesn't explain the careful, deliberate construction of the hidden room and shaft connecting house to mine, work that would have required planning, strength, and mental clarity seemingly beyond William's capabilities in his declining years. It doesn't address why the bodies were arranged as they were, or why their eyes were covered with fabric Eleanor had purchased just days before. And it cannot resolve the unsettling accounts from other miners who reported experiences similar to William's, suggesting something more widespread than an isolated case of mental illness. The Whitaker case remains suspended between explanations, resistant to categorical answers. It has become part of the darker folklore of Appalachia, a region already rich with stories of things hidden in mountains, older than human memory, of boundaries between worlds that sometimes thin in certain places under certain conditions. The documented facts provide a skeleton for the story, but the flesh of meaning that covers those bones shifts depending on who's doing the telling and who's doing the listening. In the end, perhaps the most honest assessment comes from James Cooper, the WPA worker who first discovered the hidden room in 1937. In a personal letter written years later, he reflected on his role in bringing the case back to light. People ask me sometimes what I think happened to those people, and I tell them I don't know. That's the truth of it. I've heard all the theories, madness, murder, even darker things that folks whisper about but won't say aloud. Maybe there is truth in all of them, or none. What I do know is this. Standing in that hidden room, looking down into that shaft, disappearing into darkness, I felt something I can't properly name. Not exactly fear, though that was part of it, more like recognition. Like something down there knew I was present, and I knew it was there too, and neither of us was particularly pleased about the introduction. Cooper never returned to the site after his initial discovery, requesting reassignment to flood recovery work in another county. He never explained this decision in official documentation, but in the same personal letter, he offered a glimpse of his reasoning. Some doors once opened can't be properly closed again. Better to walk away while you still remember the way back to daylight. The demolition of the Whitaker house and the sealing of the mine removed the physical traces of whatever occurred there. But the story persists, passed from one generation to the next in the small towns that dot the Appalachian foothills. It serves as a reminder that even in a world mapped and measured, there remain spaces where certainty falters, where multiple truths can exist simultaneously, where questions outnumber answers. Perhaps that is the real legacy of the Whitaker case, not the specifics of what happened on that September night in 1889, but the reminder that beneath the surface of the ordinary, depths remain unexplored. That in the silence of old houses and abandoned mines, in the spaces between documented fact and oral tradition, in the shadows that gather at the edges of rational explanation, stories wait that can never be fully told or fully forgotten. The pocket watch that once belonged to Thomas Whitaker, found hanging on the door of the empty house with its glass shattered and hands frozen at 3:17, was kept as evidence until 1962, when the case was officially closed. It was then returned to the County Historical Society, where it remains today, stored in an acid-free box in a climate-controlled room. The curator who oversees the collection reports that, despite multiple attempts at repair by skilled watchmakers, the timepiece refuses to run. The hands remain fixed at 3:17, as if that moment in 1889 continues to repeat itself, a temporal loop that never progresses toward resolution. Like the watch, the story of the Whitakers exists in a state of suspended animation, neither fully explained nor completely mysterious, a narrative where time stopped but never quite ended. In Harlan County today, few remember the details of the case, but the echoes remain in local warnings about mines after dark, about listening too closely to sounds behind walls, about the dangers of digging too deeply, both literally and figuratively, into what lies beneath the surface of everyday life. The most significant aspect of the Whitaker case from a modern perspective might be how it illuminates the particular anxieties of its era. The late 19th century was a time of rapid industrial expansion, when the mountains of Appalachia were first being hollowed out systematically for their coal. Men descended daily into darkness, altering landscapes that had remained unchanged for millennia. The psychological toll of this work, the constant danger, the physical strain, the separation from natural light and air, created a unique form of stress that manifested in various ways. Mining communities developed their own folklore and superstitions as means of processing this experience, of making sense of the inexplicable dangers and occasional tragedies that accompanied the extraction of coal from the earth. Stories of things encountered in the deepest tunnels, of presences that followed miners home, of changes that occurred in men who spent too long below. These were common elements of miners' tales throughout the region. The Whitaker case, while unusually well documented, follows patterns found in numerous other accounts from mining communities across Appalachia. Dr. Ellsworth, in his unpublished notes, observed this connection explicitly. What happened to the Whitaker family cannot be understood in isolation. It must be placed within the context of a broader pattern of experiences reported by miners throughout the region, experiences that speak to the psychological impact of industrial mining on communities previously accustomed to living in harmony with the mountains rather than extracting their resources. The boundary between mental illness and genuine encounter becomes blurred in such circumstances, with neither explanation fully accounting for the phenomena reported. This perspective gained additional support in the 1970s, when anthropologists began systematically documenting the oral traditions of Appalachian communities. They found recurring motifs that paralleled elements of the Whitaker case: hidden passages connecting homes to mines, individuals changed by prolonged exposure to certain tunnels, rituals performed to appease or contain entities believed to dwell in the depths. These stories were typically dismissed by outside observers as superstition, but they served important functions within the communities that preserved them, providing frameworks for understanding the very real dangers and psychological stresses associated with mining life. The particular horror of the Whitaker case lies in its suggestion that these folk beliefs might have contained a kernel of truth, that William Whitaker, during his entrapment in 1857, encountered something genuine, whether psychological or otherwise, that ultimately consumed not just him but his entire family. It hints at the possibility that beneath the rational explanations we construct to make sense of the world, other realities might exist, glimpsed only in moments of extremity or through the thin places where boundaries weaken. One of the most disturbing documents associated with the case, rarely mentioned in official reports, is a single page found pressed between the pages of Eleanor's journal. It contains a crude drawing, apparently made by William, showing a series of concentric circles with a small, indistinct shape at the center. Around the edges are written words in a shaky hand. It waits in the dark. It has always waited. It will always wait. We are called to witness. The handwriting has been confirmed as William's, but the meaning of the drawing and text remains open to interpretation. Was it the product of a deteriorating mind or a genuine attempt to communicate something encountered beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience? A small but dedicated community of researchers continued to investigate aspects of the Whitaker case through the latter half of the 20th century, drawn by its resistance to easy explanation and its suggestion of deeper patterns at work in the relationship between mining communities and the land they altered. Their findings, while never conclusive, added layers of complexity to the narrative and connected it to similar cases throughout the region. Dr. Abigail Ramsey, a folklorist who conducted field research in eastern Kentucky during the 1980s, documented oral accounts from elderly residents who remembered stories of the Whitaker disappearance passed down from their parents and grandparents. These versions often included details absent from the official record, claims that unusual sounds had been heard near the Whitaker property for weeks before the family vanished, reports that the abandoned house had briefly been occupied by a researcher in the early 1900s who fled after a single night, refusing to explain why. Suggestions that other families in the region had experienced similar phenomena, but had escaped whatever fate befell the Whitakers by abandoning their homes at the first sign of trouble. What emerges from these accounts, Ramsey wrote in her 1989 paper, Narratives of Disappearance in Appalachian Mining Communities, is not just a single anomalous event, but a pattern of encounters and disappearances linked to specific locations within the mining landscape. The Whitaker case is unusual not in its basic elements, but in the fact that it was documented more thoroughly than most such incidents. For every Whitaker family, there may have been dozens of similar cases that never entered the official record, preserved only in the oral traditions of communities that learned to watch for certain signs and to avoid certain places. This perspective reframes the Whitaker case from an isolated incident to part of a broader pattern of experience particular to mining communities in the Appalachian region. It suggests that whatever happened to William during his entrapment in 1857 and subsequently to the entire family in 1889 may have happened to others as well, though perhaps in less dramatic or well-documented forms. It points to a collective experience of the mining landscape as a place where boundaries could be crossed, where the act of tunneling into the earth might occasionally pierce something beyond normal reality. The most recent significant research on the case was conducted in 2005 by a team from the University of Virginia, using ground-penetrating radar to examine the area where the Whitaker house once stood. Their findings, published in the Journal of Appalachian Studies, confirmed the existence of a vertical shaft beneath the former cellar, though centuries of erosion and deliberate filling had rendered it largely inaccessible. More intriguing was their discovery of what appeared to be a network of narrow tunnels radiating outward from the base of the shaft, following patterns that matched neither natural geological formations nor standard mining techniques of the period. These structures appear to have been excavated using hand tools, the report states, and follow patterns that suggest purpose rather than random digging. However, the purpose itself remains unclear, as the tunnels do not lead to coal seams or any other obvious resource. They appear to meander through the bedrock in patterns that defy conventional explanation. The team was unable to fully explore these tunnels due to safety concerns and limited funding, but their discovery adds yet another layer to the already complex narrative of the Whitaker case. It suggests that whatever William was doing beneath the house in his final years was more extensive and systematic than previously believed, raising new questions about his mental state and intentions. The case has occasionally attracted attention from paranormal investigators and enthusiasts, though most serious researchers distance themselves from such approaches. Nevertheless, the persistent reports of unusual phenomena associated with the site, cold spots, unexplained sounds, electronic equipment malfunctioning, have been documented by multiple visitors over the decades. These reports are typically dismissed as suggestion or coincidence, but their consistency across time and different observers remains intriguing. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Whitaker case is how it illuminates the thin boundary between sanity and madness, between reality and delusion. William Whitaker began as a respected mine engineer, a man of science and practical knowledge. By the end of his life, he was sleeping in a chair by the cellar door, obsessively digging a tunnel to connect his home to the mine, convinced that something was trying to reach him from below. Was this transformation the result of mental illness, perhaps triggered or exacerbated by the trauma of his entrapment? Or did he genuinely encounter something during that week in the darkness that altered his perception of reality, something that others dismissed as delusion, but which he recognized as truth? Eleanor's journal traces her own journey along a similar path, from skepticism to reluctant belief to full acceptance of William's worldview. Thomas, the practical mine foreman, appears to have resisted this pull the longest, but even he ultimately descended into the darkness with his wife and father. The arrangement of their bodies in the mine chamber suggests a ritual purpose, a deliberate act, rather than a desperate escape or accident. What could convince three adults to sit in a circle in an abandoned mine tunnel, cover their eyes with blue fabric, and wait for death? The psychological explanation, folie à deux, expanding to include Thomas, a shared delusion that led to collective suicide, seems simplest. Yet it struggles to account for the physical evidence: the carefully constructed hidden room and shaft, the tunnels radiating outward from its base, the specific arrangement of the bodies, the symbolic blinding with fabric that Eleanor had purchased just days before. These elements suggest planning, preparation, purpose, a coherent logic driving actions that appear, from the outside, to be the products of madness. Perhaps the most disquieting possibility is that William Whitaker was neither delusional nor entirely sane, but existing in a liminal space between these states, a space where he perceived aspects of reality invisible to others. His experiences during the 1857 entrapment may have altered his perception permanently, attenuating him to patterns or presences that others could not detect. In this reading, what appears as deteriorating mental health might actually be an expanded awareness, albeit one incompatible with normal functioning in society. Eleanor's journal hints at this possibility in her final entries, as she begins to experience phenomena similar to what William had described for years. "I am beginning to understand what William has been trying to tell us," she writes on September 10, 1889. "There is something in this house with us, something that has been here all along, but which I could not previously perceive. It does not belong to our world, yet it is unmistakably present. Thomas cannot or will not see it, but I can feel its attention focused on us now, patient but persistent, like water wearing away stone." This suggestion of perception beyond normal boundaries connects the Whitaker case to broader traditions in Appalachian folklore regarding individuals who develop second sight, or the ability to perceive supernatural entities after traumatic experiences or prolonged exposure to certain places. In these traditions, such perception is often considered both a gift and a curse, a window into realities better left unobserved, an awareness that cannot be unlearned once acquired. The blue fabric covering the eyes of the Whitaker family in death takes on additional significance in this context. Was it an attempt to block out visions too disturbing to bear? A symbolic recognition that they had seen too much? Or perhaps a ritual act meant to facilitate transition between states of being or perception? The fabric itself was ordinary, purchased from the general store in town, but its use in this final act transforms it into something laden with potential meaning. The pocket watch left hanging on the door, its glass shattered and hand stopped at 3:17, similarly suggests ritual significance. Timepieces in many cultures have been associated with the boundary between worlds, with the measurement and marking of transition. The deliberate breaking of the watch, stopping time at a specific moment, could be interpreted as an attempt to freeze or mark a particular threshold. But why 3:17? The number has no obvious significance in the Whitaker case, adding yet another small mystery to the larger puzzle. Another puzzling element of the case emerged during the examination of Thomas's personal effects found in the mine chamber. His wallet contained a small folded paper with a series of numbers written in his hand: 6, 19, 8, 15, 16, 20, 8, 5, 14, 21, 13, 2, 5, 18, 19. Researchers initially assumed these might be coordinates, dates, or some form of code, but no convincing explanation has ever been established. Curiously, when arranged in groups of 3, 619, 815, 162, 81, 514, 21, 13, 5, 18, 19. The first several groups correspond roughly to mining tunnel designations used in Blackwood Coal Company records. The significance of the remaining numbers remains unclear. Eleanor's purchase of the blue fabric shortly before their disappearance has been extensively analyzed. Store records indicate it was her only purchase that day, made specifically rather than as part of her regular shopping. The fabric itself was not common in the household's existing possessions, suggesting it was obtained for a particular purpose. This premeditation implies that whatever occurred on September 16th, 17th was not entirely spontaneous, not merely a sudden crisis or break, but something anticipated, perhaps even planned for. The 3 bodies in the mine chamber were arranged in a specific configuration according to the 1962 discovery reports. They sat in a perfect equilateral triangle, each approximately 3 feet from the others, facing inward toward the center of the formation. At this center point, investigators found a small depression in the earth floor containing traces of ash and partially burned paper, evidence of a fire, though a very small, controlled one. What was burned remains unknown, though spectrographic analysis of the ash detected traces of leather, suggesting perhaps a book or journal. This arrangement has prompted various interpretations. Some researchers suggest ritual suicide, pointing to similar configurations in certain obscure religious practices. Others propose a desperate attempt to generate warmth in the cold mine tunnel, though this seems unlikely given the deliberate positioning of the bodies. Dr. Holloway, in her 1967 analysis, suggested the triangle might represent a final attempt by William to contain whatever he believed was pursuing him, a symbolic barrier or ward drawn from folklore or personal superstition. The time indicated on Thomas's pocket watch, 3:17, has been the subject of particular scrutiny. No significant event in the family's history corresponds to this time. However, Dr. Ellsworth's notes contain an intriguing connection discovered late in his research. The eastern tunnel, where William was trapped in 1857, was designated Tunnel 317 in company records. This apparent coincidence has never been satisfactorily explained, but suggests another link between the family's final actions and William's traumatic experience decades earlier. Perhaps most disturbing are the indications that the Whitakers were not the first or only victims of whatever phenomena affected them. Local records and oral histories compiled by Dr. Ramsey in the 1980s identified at least 7 other cases between 1850 and 1930 of families in the region who disappeared under unusual circumstances, often with connections to the mining industry. While none were as well documented as the Whitaker case, patterns emerge. Reports of sounds in walls or beneath floors, behavioral changes in individuals who had worked in deep mines, secret construction, or excavation, and symbolic objects left behind, often broken or altered in some way. One such case, occurring in 1906 in a town 20 miles from Blackwood Hollow, involved the Pearson family whose patriarch had worked alongside William Whitaker in the 1850s. According to local newspaper accounts, the family of 4 vanished overnight, leaving behind a home in perfect order, except for a kitchen table set with empty plates and cups. A grandfather clock in their parlor had been deliberately stopped at 3:17, its pendulum removed and placed on the mantel. No bodies were ever found, and the case remained unsolved. This apparent connection suggests the possibility that whatever affected the Whitakers might have been part of a larger pattern, a recurring phenomenon linked to specific mining activities or locations in the Appalachian region. It raises the unsettling prospect that what appeared as isolated tragedies might actually be manifestations of something more systematic, more pervasive, something embedded in the relationship between the mining communities and the mountains they transformed. The blue fabric covering the eyes of the Whitakers has been interpreted variously as symbolic blindfolding, protection from seeing something unbearable, or ritual preparation for transition between states of being. An intriguing connection emerged in Dr. Ramsey's research. Appalachian folk traditions from the 19th century included beliefs about the blue veil, or blue sight, a state of perception said to allow individuals to see beyond ordinary reality. In some accounts, blue fabric placed over the eyes was believed to facilitate this transition, particularly for those preparing to enter the afterlife or communicate with entities beyond normal perception. This tradition, largely forgotten by the mid-20th century, suggests a possible framework for understanding the Whitakers' final actions. If William, drawing on folk beliefs or personal experience, had come to believe that something from beyond ordinary reality was attempting to reach him, the blue fabric might represent not blindfolding, but its opposite, an attempt to see more clearly, to perceive directly what was normally hidden. In this interpretation, the family's final arrangement becomes not an act of despair, but of deliberate engagement, an attempt to confront directly what had pursued them for so long. The medical examiner's conclusion that the Whitakers died from suffocation remains the official cause of death, but subsequent analysis has raised questions about this determination. The partially mummified state of the bodies made precise analysis difficult, but traces of an unidentified chemical compound were detected in tissue samples from all 3 individuals. This compound, while never fully identified due to limitations in 1960s forensic technology, contained elements consistent with certain fungal alkaloids known to affect perception and consciousness. This finding prompted speculation that the family might have ingested a substance, perhaps deliberately, perhaps unknowingly, that altered their mental state during their final hours. The presence of fungal compounds connects to another aspect of mining life, the development of unusual fungi in the warm, damp conditions of deep tunnels, some of which were known to cause hallucinations or delusions when inhaled as spores over extended periods. Could William's supposed madness, and eventually Eleanor's similar experiences, have resulted from prolonged exposure to such compounds during their time in or near the mine? This possibility offers a rational explanation for some aspects of the case: the progressive nature of William's symptoms, Eleanor's eventual sharing of his perceptions, the family's seemingly willing participation in their own deaths while leaving others unaddressed. It doesn't explain the careful construction of the hidden room and shaft, the specific ritual arrangement of the bodies, or the apparent connections to other similar cases in the region. Like all proposed explanations, it illuminates portions of the mystery while leaving others in shadow. Perhaps the most profound aspect of the Whitaker case is how it forces us to confront the limitations of rational explanation, the boundaries of what we can know with certainty. The evidence meticulously gathered over decades by researchers like Cooper, Ellsworth, Holloway, and Ramsey provides a framework for understanding what happened to the family, but cannot fully penetrate to the why. It cannot tell us what William experienced during that week of entrapment in 1857, what Eleanor heard moving behind the walls of their home, what compelled all three family members to descend into darkness together on that September night in 1889. The case exists in the liminal space between explanation and mystery, between the documented facts and the inferences we draw from them. It reminds us that even in an age of science and rationality, aspects of human experience remain beyond our full comprehension, that beneath the surface of everyday life, depths remain that we can glimpse but never fully illuminate. In the end, perhaps the most honest response to the Whitaker case is to acknowledge both what we know and what we don't, to recognize the boundaries of certainty and the shadows that persist beyond them. The family disappeared on September 17, 1889. Their remains were discovered in 1962, arranged in a triangular formation in an abandoned mine tunnel, their eyes covered with blue fabric. These are the facts. What they mean, what led three people to such a fate, what awaited them in that darkness. These questions remain open, hovering at the edge of understanding, reminding us that some mysteries resist complete resolution, and perhaps that resistance to explanation is precisely what gives the Whitaker case its enduring power to disturb. In a world increasingly mapped, measured, and explained, it stands as a reminder that beneath the surface of the ordinary, other realities may wait, glimpsed only in moments of extremity or through the perception of minds altered by trauma, chemicals, or experiences beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. It suggests that in the silence of old houses and abandoned mines, in the spaces between documented fact and oral tradition, in the shadows that gather at the edges of rational explanation, stories wait that can never be fully told or fully forgotten. Stories that continue to whisper to those willing to listen, to hint at patterns and connections beyond our ability to fully comprehend. The legacy of the Whitaker case lives on not just in academic studies or local folklore, but in how it has shaped the collective imagination regarding the relationship between humanity and the depths we excavate, both literal and metaphorical. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of dismissing the perceptions of others, about the thin boundaries between sanity and madness, about the consequences of digging too deeply into places better left undisturbed. It reminds us that beneath the surface of the everyday, mysteries persist that resist our most determined efforts to explain them away. And perhaps, like James Cooper, standing at the edge of that hidden shaft in 1937, we are wise to acknowledge what we feel in such spaces without attempting to name it too precisely or understand it too completely. Some recognitions are sufficient in themselves, requiring neither elaboration nor resolution. Some stories matter not because they can be solved, but because they cannot, because they remind us of the boundaries of knowledge and the shadows that persist at its edges, watching and waiting for moments when our certainty falters and other possibilities emerge. The Whitaker family vanished from Blackwood Hollow on September 17, 1889. Their fate remained unknown until their remains were discovered in 1962, arranged in a triangle in an abandoned mine tunnel, their eyes covered with blue fabric. These are the facts. What they mean, what led three people to descend into darkness together, what awaited them there. These questions remain open, suspended in the space between history and folklore, between document and whisper, between the world as we understand it and the world as it sometimes reveals itself to be in places like the Appalachian Mountains, where the boundaries between known and unknown have always been thinner than we might prefer to believe.